Kate Falcha, welcome to Irishgrannyhelen. It's time for our Saturday book, and we are continuing our journey, an epic journey, into the real Marilyn Monroe by Larry Jordan, and the subtitle is Debunking the Myths and Revealing Intimate New Details of Her Life and Death. I recommend this book strongly. It's a fast read, but it has a lot of substance. It's very entertaining. It's very compelling. I have a hard time putting it down. The only problem is I don't have endless amounts of hours in the day to be taking notes. So I have to keep reluctantly setting it aside and then coming back to it. It is so interesting because he manages to bring all these different narratives, rumors, false gossip, truth, eyewitness stuff, and put it all into this chronology. I would recommend this book over any other book that's out there about Marilyn Monroe because they almost all have an axe to grind of one sort or another. Now, this book was written just this year, well, published just this year. I think it's been written across the ages. Look at how heavy, how many pages. And somebody was asking me who did the photograph on the cover, and I forgot to look it up, so let me see here. Oh, darn it. I don't see it. I don't know. I'm going to have to do a little research. I think it was mentioned somewhere in the book. I do think it was mentioned, and I just don't remember because a lot of photographs are mentioned. In fact, it talks a lot about her photographic legacy. She was a photographic model more than anything else. Well, that's not fair because she was quite the actress, but her other career as a model for photography never really ended, and she was prolific. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Enough of me editorializing. Let's go back to the book. So we're on chapter 8, which is called She Keeps Plugging Away. Oh, I didn't do my little thing. Video number 3, chapter 8. So Elia Kazan, director, is described here as a Lothario and a misogynist. And he heard that she was really emotionally invested in her acting, and he preyed upon her, and he won her over, and then he talked terribly about her. But her association with him led to her meeting and then befriending JFK. So it was an important connection there. Near the end of 1955, Kazan wrote a letter to his wife confessing his affair with Marilyn. He said of her, "You couldn't help being touched. She was talented, funny, vulnerable, helpless in awful pain, with no hope and some worth, and not a liar, not vicious, not catty, and with a history of orphanism that was killing to hear." But he also said terrible things about her. He introduced her to super agent Charles Feldman and his wife, the actress and photographer Jean Howard. Marilyn and Elia used the Feldman residence to rendezvous at times. Jean said, "I was very fond of her. I wish I'd gotten to know her better. I think I could have been a good friend, could have helped her. She needed a friend. She had no woman friends. Used and misused, if anybody ever was." But as fate would have it, Charles Feldman was close to a young, aspiring politician named John Kennedy, who quickly became interested in the young starlet, as has been well documented, years before some biographers claim the two crossed paths. Then she met Arthur Miller, which was a little unfortunate encounter, and she was on the set of the movie that they, I don't know, can't remember now which movie it was, but she was on the set and she was crying. Not a part of the acting. She was really crying. And he said to her, "You're the saddest girl I've ever met." He says that he had an electric shock that ran through him when they first shook hands. He said she should act on stage. And this was laughed at when he said it. But in her diary, she wrote that she felt highly complimented because he was a serious writer of drama who saw her potential to become a serious actor. She wrote about their encounter. Met a man tonight. It was bam. It was like running into a tree, you know, like a cool drink when you've had a fever. Arthur was married at the time, and despite his attraction to the actress, supposedly did not act on his impulses. Kazan set Miller up to escort Marilyn Monroe and to some event, and they stopped off at a bookstore. Interesting person to go book shopping with, one of the greatest playwrights, in American history. She brought several books of poetry. They had a long distance friendship for 4 years. Okay, but she was still modeling. She didn't fear and dread modeling the way she did acting. Acting brought a lot of angst as that performance anxiety, She got her photo in Life magazine. She presented at the Academy Awards. And when one snarky columnist said she looked better in a potato sack, commenting on her outfit, Fox did a photo shoot with her dressed in a potato sack and sent it across the country to, nationwide syndication. It was a huge hit. So many requests for her photo happened that Zanuck put her in every blonde role he could find. On purpose, she arrived late to a Fox party for theaters. They had this party for all the theater people that, the cinema that showed their films. And she was fashionably late and got a lot of attention when she made her big entrance. She changed representation. She signed with the Famous Artists Agency. She got attention for her bathing suit that she was wearing. She got attention for stepping into a shower on the set. Just create a lot of buzz around her all the time. But while all this was going on and she was being objectified right and left, she was taking UCLA literature courses. The New York Times critic called her role in Young as You Feel superb. She was singled out for comment. She got good reviews for small roles in the Hollywood Reporter and the LA Times. She was beginning to get notice. She was friends and roommates for a while with Shelley Winters. They actually were so poor, they shared one swimsuit that they traded off, and they shared a mink coat. They got together for kind of fun to make a list of the kind of guys that they knew, like actors or whoever, that they would be willing to date. And there was nobody on the list under 55. She ate a very controlled diet, and they describe this diet in detail, and it's just Spartan. She did not tan. She didn't go out into the sun to tan. She said she liked to feel blonde all over. Clever remark, actually. She ate very, very little. She was actually, she was a really good cook. She was a self-taught cook, and she was actually writing a cookbook. Once in a while, she would allow herself to stop and get a hot fudge sundae. She was one of the early embracers of bodybuilding exercises for definition, for maintaining a particular appearance. In Hollywood, I mean, sure, there were people who did that elsewhere, but one of the few actresses, she did bust firming exercises. So she was also a student of the Stanislavski method of acting of Michael Chekhov, who gave drama lessons. And his thing was, well, Stanislavski's this Russian actor, method actor, who taught actors that in order to give a believable performance, you needed to tap into your psyche, to your past experiences, and get those emotions out to the surface to give a believable performance. And Marilyn impressed this teacher, Michael Chekhov. I wonder if he's any relation, didn't say. He was a man that she very much admired. And this was the direction that her acting went in. Chapter 9, 1952 was a busy year, is the name of this chapter. She was living with Natasha, her coach, full of self-doubt, very dependent on this coach. In early 51, she had started seeing a psychoanalyst, and so now we're almost a year later. March of 1952, Aline Mosby, a writer of some sort, broke the story about her making nude calendars, posing earlier, for these nude calendars. And this could have been a big, gigantic scandal because, the 50s. But she just admitted to it. And she said, yeah, I did. I'm not ashamed of it. I did it because I was hungry and I had no money. I'm not ashamed. I've done nothing wrong. And it kind of just fizzled out as a story. In 2015, the originals for that calendar sold for $8 million. Joe DiMaggio was 12 years older than she and saw her, in a picture and wanted to date her. She didn't like his type. In my opinion, she should have listened to her intuition. But her agent insisted, no, you should go out with this guy because it's good PR. He's really well known. Baseball player. So this romance grew. He was older and more staid, the book says, which cracks me up because I think that I will translate that into kind of boring. And he was shyer than she thought he would be because he's kind of a big walking ego. He was a big retired baseball hero, but he drank and smoked and cheated. He was married. He was a bad husband, bad dad. He was also a very jealous individual. They had an affair, but she kept her own place. She wouldn't move in with him. I guess maybe he had broken up. She wouldn't move in with him because she wanted to keep him at arm's length and wanted her own independence. She wanted children. Sad subplot to her life. But she was very concerned about keeping her good looks because, she made her way as a pinup girl, a model, and an actress, and she was really concerned about keeping her beauty. In 52, as a surgeon was getting ready to remove her appendix due to a painful case of appendicitis, he found a handwritten note on her abdomen which said, "Cut as little as possible, no ovaries removed, do whatever you can to prevent large scars." This is related to her desire to have children someday, which she actually often did tell friends that was her goal. So she met Joe DiMaggio, and he had a very traditional Italian family. He was number 8 child in the family. It didn't really say how many were there in all, but 8's enough. And in the summer of 52, while this relationship was developing, 5 of her films were released almost all at the same time this summer. She'd been doing little roles in all these different films, and they all finally came out. Clash by Night, We're Not Married, Don't Bother to Knock. Those were the first 3. Zanuck told her to get rid of Natasha, the acting coach, called her a Svengali, because on one set, Marilyn had asked him, can you get me a dialogue director, somebody to coach my dialogue. Natasha thinks it's important, and he's like, what are you talking about? But she was very psychologically dependent on this coach who encouraged that dependence. But the studio kind of had to put up with her because she was becoming more and more popular. She was a rising star, and she was almost their biggest box office draw. Like if she was in a movie, that movie would make the most money. So then she did a movie called Full House. She had a 1-minute scene, but she got top billing. And then she was in Monkey Business. She moved into, now she's making some money. She moved into the Hollywood Hills into a house with Joe DiMaggio, but she paid the rent to the house. So this will floor anybody from California who hears this. Sit down, take a deep breath, wait till you hear this. They paid $225 a month in rent. Today it would cost minimum $2,221. Natasha and Joe did not like each other. They didn't get along. He wouldn't let Natasha speak to Marilyn Monroe. If he answered the phone and she asked to speak to Marilyn, he wouldn't let her. One of the red warning signs of an abusive relationship is when the perpetrator tries to separate from your family and friends and acquaintances. FYI. So then she made this movie, Niagara, and I just watched it the other day. It was billed as a dark noir, film noir. It was no Barbara Stanwyck movie, I hate to say. It was with Joseph Cotton, was the, kind of the bad guy. I have to say I didn't like it, and I have to say I didn't like it because it was very dated, in my opinion. There's a young couple in there, and their whole relationship is just smarmy 1950s. It was really hard to take. I guess I shouldn't look at this movie through a modern lens, but it's virtually impossible. And it's all the things that were bad about the objectification of women and the subordinate role of women. But Marilyn Monroe was really good in it, and she is undeniably magnetic. You just can't help staring at her all the time. When she's in a scene, you don't look at anybody else. And I don't know why. It's so weird. She had this personal magnetism about her. And then there was a lot of talk in the movie about the walk. I think I talk about it here. Let me see here if I wrote it down. This movie made her career. She worked well with the director Henry Hathaway, and everyone was worried when the movie first was cast that, oh, you can't put those two together. She'll never get along with him. But she got along really, really well with him. And they filmed it on location at the Falls in New York, the Niagara Falls. And I will say this, it was so noisy. Falls are very noisy. I found it was sort of stressful. I think that was probably the point, one of the points of the movie, is the falls kind of had a bit role in the movie. But, putting on raincoats and boots to go get all wet in a boat, I don't know. The New York Times critic called her two more wonders of the world. Figure out what that meant. And they described one of her scenes, although there were a couple of scenes like this in the movie, called The Longest Walk in Cinema History. She walks away from the camera, and the camera just watches her walk. Then she made a radio play, and it was a big hit. She was really good in it. Ray Anthony, the band leader, threw her a party. She just made friends everywhere she went. This guy just decided to throw her a party because he really liked her. And she arrived in a helicopter. She was the Grand Marshal at the Miss America Parade of 1952 in Atlantic City. And she stole the scene from all, Miss America and all the other runners-up. The photographers were only interested in taking pictures of Marilyn. And she had this big bouquet of roses, and she kept throwing one rose at a time to the crowd, and the crowd was just going insane. A studio publicist who was there said traveling with her was like traveling with a buzzsaw. She was chronically late, and not because she was such a diva, although she strategically did that a couple of times, obviously. But she was often late. She'd be way early to get to the studio, and she'd be in her dressing room, and then she wouldn't come on the set. And it was because she was so freaked out and had such bad stage fright and was such a perfectionist. It wasn't because she wanted attention. It was the opposite. She was so insecure. Chapter 10, first saw her name in lights. So she had a photo shoot of a famous pose in a red dress that was really famous. This is her in Niagara. And this is the famous pose. This dress was a red dress. It was actually a secondhand dress, interestingly enough. That picture made a big splash. That photograph made a big splash. Then she signed a lease alone on an apartment in West Hollywood, but it was only 3 rooms. It was this tiny little apartment, and she often stayed there with Joe DiMaggio, and he had the house, but she wanted personal freedom. She always kept a bit of a distance. He really wanted her to quit acting and become a wife and mother like his mama. Pretty traditional, very controlling. But she was a rising star, and the book talks about all these things she did. Red Book voted her the best young box office personality. Look magazine voted her the most promising female newcomer of 1952. Photoplay called her the fastest rising star of 1952. When she was receiving the award for that, she wore a gold lame dress, and she had borrowed it from another actress. I want to say Rita Hayworth. I don't remember. I should have written it down. But there was an interesting comment made about it. It created havoc, this gold lame dress. I guess it was form-fitting. She was praised by the media for upstaging the other stars at the event, especially Joan Crawford. And Joan Crawford was, what Joan Crawford was, bananas. In an interview the same month with the Associated Press, the snooty Miss Crawford denounced Marilyn for, quote, the ridiculous show, asserting that the sight of Monroe in this dress, sashaying, caused those of us in the industry to shudder, as though she wasn't part of the industry. Crawford scolded, quote, she should be told that the public likes provocative feminine personalities, but it also likes to know that underneath, the actresses are ladies. Crawford further declared, young people don't like Marilyn because they don't like to see that sex is exploited. And don't forget the women. They don't drag their family to movie theaters if the film doesn't fit with their husband and children. And this rebuke really stunned Marilyn. She couldn't understand the animosity. So Crawford had already been nasty to her. There was this description of her meeting Joan Crawford, and Joan Crawford took her aside to give her a little advice and said to her, that dress you're wearing, this is not the gold lame dress. This is another time at a dinner party, I think. That dress you're wearing is utterly incorrect. Darling, make a list of all your clothes, and I'll make a list of all the things you need to buy, and see that you buy the right things. Marilyn Monroe talked about this later, and she said, this is Joan Crawford is talking to me like this. She said, I was broke. But for some reason, I couldn't tell Miss Crawford that. And I couldn't tell her that she'd seen my whole entire full wardrobe. She had like 3 dresses or something. Luella Parsons actually defended her. Now, Luella Parsons had a reputation for being acerbic. But for some reason, they hit it off. Luella liked Marilyn, always gave her good press. She tactfully responded, Luella did. Luella wrote about Marilyn Monroe saying this. Why should Crawford select me to blast? She's a great star. I'm just starting. And that, when the first hurt began to die down, I told myself she must have spoken to Mr. Thomas impulsively without thinking about, families don't want to see her, So Luella Parsons did her a solid by publishing that. Marilyn didn't have to say it out loud herself. Somebody else said it, so she couldn't be accused of being defensive or snarky, but the information got out there. For the award ceremony, the studio had gone out of its way to dress her in this gold lame dress, but especially they even got her special body shaper underwear and told her how to walk and how to present herself. But she came in obviously without the foundation garment. And later on, she apologized to Zanuck. She said, I couldn't wear it. It was just uncomfortable. She got the main role in the movie Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, but was paid far less than her co-star Jane Russell. She got $500, Marilyn Monroe did, for her part in this fabulous movie. And Russell got $200,000, no kidding. Also, Jane Russell got a dressing room and Marilyn didn't. Russell described Marilyn Monroe as shy, sweet, and far more intelligent than people give her credit for. Jane tried to convert me to religion, said Marilyn, and I tried to introduce her to Freud. She's been described as musically naturally gifted. She did some musical numbers, and this is what the people doing the music in the show said. She moved beautifully, she cared deeply, and she focused on her role. She wasn't distracted. I think that what the book said was between takes, other people were laughing and chatting and carrying on, and she was still in kind of a role, focusing on it. She studied the bones and the muscles of the body to accentuate her physical presence. She understood how the body moved, and obviously she practiced moving in the front of mirror. She did her own singing, except for the very highest notes. And here's an interesting little Hollywood tidbit. There was a woman called Marnie Nixon, and Marnie Nixon was what was called a ghost singer. Great stars who couldn't sing would move their mouths, and it was really her voice. She sang for Deborah Kerr in The King and I. She sang for Natalie Wood in West Side Story. She sang for Audrey Hepburn in My Fair Lady. Audrey Hepburn was no Julie Andrews. She sang for Sophia Loren in Beyond a Boy on a Dolphin. The King and I, when the album came out with Marnie Nixon, uncredited, it was sold in the hundreds of thousands, and Marnie got $420. Kerr broke the silence and said, no, this is not right, and she credited Marnie. Eventually, Marnie made her great public debut. She played in The Sound of Music, speaking of Julie Andrews. She played Sister Sophia in The Sound of Music, and ended up having a huge career. Somebody called her the ghostest with the mostest. So in 1953, the movie was released, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, right? Am I right? And Marilyn Monroe, her career really took off. She got to do her hands and feet at Grauman's, and she made a funny joke at the time. She said, oh, well, Jane Russell should put her breasts in the cement, and I should put my butt in the cement. She later recalled seeing her name in theater lights while driving down the street. She was taking a friend to the airport. That's the kind of friend she was. In Los Angeles, you drive a friend to LAX, you're a real friend, I gotta tell you. But she was driving along and saw her name in neon at a theater, and she had to pull over. She just couldn't even believe it. In September of 53, she made an appearance on the Jack Benny Show. He could not pay her because of her contract with Zanuck. would have broken the contract. So what he did instead is he gave her a gift. He gave her a brand new black convertible Cadillac. Years later, it was sold to Robert Wagner. So her mother, Gladys, I can't remember, was dying of liver cancer, and she took an overdose of Nembutal, and at her funeral or wake or whatever, Marilyn was saying, "I feel like an anchor is gone." In October, she hired Inez Melson as a business manager. Inez loved Marilyn Monroe at once, she said. Inez said she was like a fluffy toy. She fooled Inez. So, How to Marry a Millionaire. It was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was the other movie. How to Marry a Millionaire. It's all about 3 young women who pursue millionaire husbands. And Marilyn Monroe plays this nearsighted department store model with big, thick glasses on. And she made a comment in the movie that's actually an old saying, twisted a little bit, clean it up. Men aren't attentive to girls who wear glasses, she said. And her role in the movie was as this terribly handicapped by nearsightedness young woman who is so afraid of being overlooked because she has glasses on that she doesn't wear her glasses, and she's always walking into walls and being clumsy and dropping things. She hired a tutor on her own of pantomime to teach her how to be clumsy with panache. The director was impressed at her work ethic. She was just incredibly focused. He couldn't get over how focused she was. She would do 12-hour days. She'd go from classes and lessons and coaching and exercise and filming, and then afterwards more work. Betty Grable was in it. Betty Grable and Marilyn Monroe really liked each other, despite the fact that the press kept trying to stir up some sort of fake animosity between them. They got along great. They really liked each other. Grable did not like the fact that Marilyn was always doing retakes. She did 15 in one scene. But she said, yeah, that's annoying, and although it wasn't unusual for other actors. Grable said, yeah, it's annoying that Marilyn Monroe does that, but she doesn't have any meanness in her, no bitchery. She's just really a great person. Grable was touched that Marilyn Monroe was the only one involved in this filming who called her. One day they were filming, and Grable got an emergency phone call that her daughter had been hurt in a fall and had to rush to the hospital. And she said that night, the only person who called to see if she was okay was Marilyn Monroe. And eventually, Betty Grable had a big fight with Daryl Zanuck and tore up her contract and threw it in his face. But she wasn't mad at Marilyn. She was mad at Zanuck. Marilyn inherited her dressing room, but she was very smart. They wanted her to pose in front of the dressing room, and it still had Betty Grable's name and her star on it, and she refused. She knew that would be would reflect poorly on her, so she refused to do it. Lauren Bacall advised her to stand up for herself. She took her aside. She said, don't let them, the studio, don't let them push you around. I've always been a troublemaker, and you can be too. In The River of No Return that she made with Robert Mitchum, with the director Otto Preminger, Otto Preminger doesn't have a great reputation from what I've read. He was kind of a nasty piece of work. Allegedly, Marilyn Monroe had 4 musical numbers. The show was set in Canada. It was shot in Canada. Natasha came along, her coach, and immediately fell into an enmity with Otto Preminger. Otto tried to ban Natasha from the set. So you're talking about 2 control freaks, like 2 dogs with a bone, fighting over Marilyn. Tried to ban her from the filming, from the set, but Marilyn Monroe called Zanuck, and he told Preminger, let Natasha stay. And Otto took it out on Marilyn. He bullied her. He told her, quit, go back to your original profession. Piece of work, right? And it was a real physical ordeal to film this, besides the psychological abuse she got from him. For example, they had to do this rapids ride in a raft, and, you know, of course it was fake, but they had to keep throwing buckets of water on her for hours and hours and hours. But she never complained, and interestingly, the entire crew adored her. They loved her. All the real people absolutely loved her. But she almost drowned at one point in the show. She was pulled under. She was in wading boots, and she slipped on a rock. She wasn't supposed to go into the water fully, and she slipped on a rock, and the water filled the boots and dragged her under. And Robert Mitchum and Whitey, her makeup artist, and Whitey Snyder and others had to jump in and save her. And her foot was damaged. She was in a cast and used crutches for days afterwards. There's pictures of her being carried around in a cast. She did a ton of interviews. She was really always accessible to her fans and to the media. She was clever in knowing that that's how you get your name out there. But she was also such a nice person. She couldn't be supercilious and act all grand. In one part of the movie, there was a child actor who kept avoiding her. It was really noticeable. So she took the kid aside and she said, you know, what's the problem? And the child said, oh, well, my priest told me to stay away from you. But she won him over. Joe showed up. Now, Joe didn't like her acting. And Joe was extremely jealous of her fame, her notoriety, her success, and anyone she worked with. Really controlling and really jealous. Whitey Snyder, her makeup artist, said that Joe could be very hard to get along with. He brought his own this is me talking, brought his own dark cloud, just black cloud with him everywhere he went. Here's a picture of Whitey helping her, carrying her when her foot was injured. So Whitey Snyder said Joe could be very hard to get along with, surly and withdrawn, and he was awfully jealous. Marilyn liked to invite a few people for coffee or a drink at the end of the day, but when Joe was around, the mood was dark. He hated the movies and everything to do with them. Snyder further recalled a conversation he had with Marilyn as they rode a train past breathtaking Canadian scenery. Quote, "Here are the Rockies, Marilyn. If you're really in love with Joe, why don't you get out of the movie business? The two of you could move up here, build yourself a beautiful house, settle down, and have kids." She remained silent for a moment, pondering what Whitey, had said. And then she replied softly, "I know all that, but I can't do that. I just can't." So she went to the opening night of the premiere of How to Marry a Millionaire, and Joe refused to escort her. She was interviewed going in, and she said, "This is just about the happiest night of my life." So there was a lot of communist rhetoric, accusations made about her. And it's called a distraction from the many ills that are afflicting Americans. She really wasn't politically active. Joe tried to prevent her from doing the required post-production work on The River of No Return, but she was told that she was obligated contractually, so she did it. But then she refused to make this movie that Zanuck had been pushing at her, Pink Tights. And instead she left LA. She went to San Francisco with Joe for Christmas. And where did this communist rhetoric come from? Well, it came from the people in her periphery who had, I mean, this was a time period when if you had signed a Communist Party card in the 1920s, when it was stylish, people would pass these things around at parties. It came back to haunt you. So they went to San Francisco for Christmas, and she risked getting fired going there, leaving like that. And Joe was hoping she would. I mean, he was trying to sabotage her. Zanuck retaliated by denying her a role that she really wanted in the movie The Egyptian. Playboy ran one of her calendar photos, and it made a ton of money, and she never got anything. She didn't even get an acknowledgement of thanks for this picture helping Playboy to make money. Now we're on chapter 11. For the first time, I feel like a star. So they got married, and she wrote down her age as 25 on the marriage thing, but licensed, but she was really 27. big difference, right? So why did she marry him? Interestingly, she altered the vows. She vowed to love, honor, and cherish, not love, honor, and obey, which was standard in those days. So why did she marry him? I don't know. I guess we have to get it from context here. 15 days after they got married, they went to Japan because Joe had to help train some Japanese baseball teams. So she went with him, and she had been cooking up a plan independent of the trip to Japan. She had been planning on going to Korea to entertain the troops, you know, Korean War. And she had an encounter with Cary Grant somewhere at some social thing, and Cary Grant really talked it up and urged her to go entertain the troops. So this was percolating, and so here she is in Japan, and she had nothing to do. When they got there, this is interesting, when they got there, she was the #1 foreign box office star in Japan. And when they got to the airport, 5,000 fans greeted them. They were trapped on the runway in the airplane for 45 minutes until the Air Force had to come and rescue her. They had to sneak her out through the cargo hatch while somebody distracted them at the regular exit. 100,000 people lined the 20-mile route between the airport and the hotel. It took 200 cops to guard the hotel. She finally was convinced to come out on a balcony and wave at the crowd. And she said it terrified her. All she could think of was the newsreels she had seen of dictators waving at, you know, their crowds. So the fans thought that she was going to Korea. There was this sort of scuttlebutt going around that that's why she was in Japan. And Joe, meantime, he's doing his training, his baseball players, and he's all mad. He was jealous that she was getting so much attention. She was getting all the attention, and he was just her escort, you know. So she was invited to visit the emperor, who presented her with pearls that had a diamond clasp. She lamented that she couldn't just be a tourist. She tried to go on these tourist sites and was mobbed everywhere she went. She said once later that Japan turned out to be another country I never saw. But she did make visits to GIs that were in hospitals, had been shipped out from Korea into Japanese hospitals. And she finally just said, okay, and she just agreed to go visit Korea then, because a general in Korea heard that she was in Japan and asked her, please come. So she ended up doing 10 shows over 4 days for more than 100,000 GIs. And when she went to Japan, she had no show. But she managed to put together a show in that limited amount of time. They found a piano player that was a soldier, a GI piano player, and he just gushed about her. He talked about her for the rest of his life. Because he actually was like her travel companion, because they had to work on the numbers that they did very closely. And he's a younger guy, you know, and he said she was absolutely wonderful, a pleasure to work with. She was a perfectionist, but she was nice about it. He said she was a different person in each of the songs she sang. She was able to evoke a completely different persona. At one point, right before she went on stage, she had to go to the bathroom, and there was no bathroom that was accessible without going down the stage and through the crowd. And, this is some sort of military place. And so they came up with a solution where they were on the first floor, and she climbed out a window and down a ladder to find the bathroom. And people who saw her there said she was just the best medicine for everybody. The next day, this was still in Japan. Sorry about that. The next day, at the airport on the way to Korea, Joe he accompanied her to get on the plane. He didn't go with her. He was really, really rude to the piano player guy who never forgot and talked about it. She had to get, she had to get vaccinated. That's right. I forgot about that, for cholera and yellow fever before she could go to Korea. She had nothing warm to wear because that wasn't in the plan. It was cold where they were in Korea. So the army gave her a whole set of winter army clothes. And there's cute pictures of her, all dressed up in these soldiers' clothes. And she managed to make them look good too. More newsmen accompanied her to the front in 1952 than accompanied Eisenhower. Many guys hitchhiked or walked 10 miles in these GIs to see her where she was performing. Some of them saved their seats for 7 hours. 5 Marine wiremen, like guys who fixed telephone wires for the Marines, climbed poles and hung from safety harnesses so they could see her because there was no place to sit. So she took off her winter coat. The crowd went nuts. Joe, she said, she told him later, she made this statement: "For the first time in my life, I felt like a star." She kept the photo of herself inside of a Jeep. It was this really cute photo of her in a Jeep. She kept it with her. It was a picture of her sitting between 2 GIs. For the rest of her life, she carried it with her everywhere she went. For the men, she symbolized all the women in their lives that they missed. And she said that she felt at home. She was heartbroken when she saw hungry children scavenging in trash cans for food. She never complained. People said, "Wow, here's this gigantic star." And she ate the same food the GIs ate. She slept in the same accommodations. She didn't ask for anything special. She was completely unspoiled. She made sure that the band was included in all the parties that were thrown for her, and all the get-togethers and everything after the shows. Often that wouldn't have been the case because they weren't important. She made sure they all got to go. Somebody commented that she seemed to need mothering, and she seemed to be very lonely. She was cold. She was freezing cold the whole time she was there. But she ate the same food and stayed in the same place as the men. This woman, Liesl Bradner, said, "Monroe was at her peak in Korea, confident, spontaneous, and heartbreakingly beautiful. She did it all on her own without the often critical direction of her paid Hollywood handlers or her overbearing husband. The Far East Command awarded Marilyn Monroe a silver medallion for entertaining the troops and visiting the sick and wounded in Japanese hospitals." But, the stress and everything, the exposure to all those people, she ended up catching a really bad bronchial virus and was really sick on the way home in the plane. Chapter 12, a sad ending, a happy beginning. So when she got home, she was very sick for the first couple of days in San Francisco. In March of 54, she flew to Los Angeles for an award from Photoplay, the most popular actress, and Joe boycotted that too. Man, he was jealous. She was seated at a table away from Zanuck, who had her under suspension. They were always fighting. In the LA Times, once again, she was compared to Jean Harlow. She told Hedda Hopper is another one of these gossip people. She told Hedda Hopper she was holding out for a script that was better than Pink Tights. This is the big bone of contention with Daryl Zanuck. Oh, a little quote here again. Interestingly, Hopper reported that, quote, Marilyn revealed that she and Joe had definitely decided on matrimony only 2 days before the ceremony took place. She doesn't have an engagement ring. Quote, I told Joe I didn't want one, Marilyn said. My main interest was in a wedding ring. It's gold, white gold or platinum with a circle of Beckett diamonds. Believe it or not, said the blonde, who sang diamonds are the girl's best friend. They're the only ones I have, the only diamonds that she had. The trip to Korea was a major positive PR trip. She got voted the sexiest sweetheart for the GIs. Zanuck was forced to give in. he lost his power of control over her, and he had even been considering a big role for Marilyn Monroe as Sheba in The Queen of Sheba. But Fox ended up not making the movie and didn't even, never got far enough to give her any role, to give anybody a role. They just sat on it. The agent, Charles Feldman, wanted her to write her autobiography at this point, and she said no. Instead, she agreed to do a series of interviews with Ben Hecht for a big magazine article. His agent stole the draft of the article, rewrote it with lies, changed it, and sold it to the London Empire News without permission. Ben Hecht fired his agent for fraud. The article talks about events and quotes that, things that Marilyn Monroe had never said, never attended, and it was lies. It was a lot of lies. It was printed after her death as, quote, my story by her friend, Milton Green, but it's not her authorized autobiography, and much more about Green coming up. When the River of No Return was released, she really hated her role. She thought she was just terrible in it. She said, I've got to get better movies. So she began to plan a getaway from the studios. She wanted to join the Actors Studio. This big mistake, I might add. She was working and training and studying very hard, and she didn't rest on her laurels. She didn't appreciate her own value, and when she wasn't working in the movie, she was doing more photographic work. She leaned heavily on Natasha and later on Paula Strasberg with the Actors Studio. We'll get to that. But ultimately, she made her own artistic choices. She at least did that. She lived for 2 months with Joe in San Francisco. She's still boycotting LA. Fox lifted the suspension and stopped trying to push Pink Tights on her and offered her There's No Business Like Show Business. And she held out and got a better contract for that included the movie The 7-Year Itch. She demanded an increase in pay to $3,000 a week. She demanded control over her musical numbers and the ability to pick her own choreographer and vocal coach. She and Joe got a house in Beverly Hills for $750 a month. Oh my God. It's now worth $8,958 a month today. But they had a very strained relationship. Joe wouldn't go to movie social events with her, openings and dinners and stuff, and complained about her working and gone all day long, working too hard, being gone all day, and only coming home to sleep. And he said, I could just as well have stayed a bachelor. You're married to the studio. On the set of There's No Business Like Show Business, she was often late to the set, and we talked about that. Her role was bigger in this, and it helped to improve the movie when they made it bigger. They even gave some of Ethel Merman's songs to Marilyn Monroe, and Merman had the final big number, and they all were in this big number, but Merman was the central feature of this big number, and she asked them to put a big bow on the front of her gown. And she said she wanted to have at least as big a bosom as Marilyn Monroe. She was praised for her nuanced delivery of Irving Berlin's "After you get what you want, you don't want it." That's a song. The number Heatwave was huge. The day that they filmed this, this is a quote, "The atmosphere on the cavernous soundstage was like the moment before a big storm breaks. The tension on the set was visceral." Joe watched. He was lurking in the background. There was a photographer with Merman, and the photographer took pictures of Marilyn Monroe with Merman, but Joe refused to be photographed with his own wife. He didn't like her to perform, and he simply didn't like her to perform, provocatively the way that number was. I think this is an interesting little couple of paragraphs here I'd like to read. Susan Strasberg, the daughter of Paula and Lee Strasberg of the Actors Studio, had this to say. Susan was impressed by her first experience watching Monroe at work in front of the camera doing a complicated number. Quote, "She started singing and dancing as if it were the thing she wanted to do more than anything in the world, as if 100 people weren't waiting for her to make a mistake, as if the man she loved weren't watching and judging, as if it weren't 100 degrees under the lights, as if $1 million weren't riding on her performance. She flashed a 200-watt smile as she swayed, sashayed, and swung those hips. Afterwards, Joe rushed to greet them, and Joe and Susan, and he seemed to withdraw behind some invisible shield, tightening his body against her. He became more taciturn than before, if that were possible. She froze for a moment, like a pointer. After she kissed him, she apologized for almost getting makeup on him. DiMaggio was as cold as ice. He stormed off, and filming resumed. And Marilyn, perspiring heavily and obviously rattled by her husband's aloofness, forgot her lines and slipped and fell. While she was getting refreshed, Sidney Skalski introduced her to young Susan Strasberg and her mother, Paula. Marilyn at once recognized the name and informed Mrs. Strasberg that she was very interested in meeting her husband, Lee, whom she'd heard about so much about as an acting coach in New York. In response, Marilyn was invited to stop by the Actors Studio the next time she was in town. Unfortunately, I would add. There was a very prudish general media reaction to the sexy numbers in this movie. The New York Times quote said, "Embarrassing to behold." Ed Sullivan said, "One of the most flagrant violations of good taste he'd ever seen." Today, it's mildly risque. The film made $5.1 million, but had a lot of cost overruns, and Fox lost almost $1 million, $950,000. It was the 13th most popular film of 54. Mitzi Gaynor in the picture talked wistfully about Marilyn later. Quote, "I get very choked up when I think about her. She was empowering. She never upstaged you. She never got in your way. She never got in your light. She was known as a dumb blonde, but she was about as dumb as Winston Churchill. I mean it. She knew what she wanted. She knew how to get it. It killed her. She was more and more frightened all the time, and the more frightened she got, the more vulnerable she became. And the more vulnerable she became, the more you could see there was really such a soul in there. But she was used. She gave and gave and gave and gave and gave." A description of her effect on all the famous celebrities and press and executives when she came for lunch at the Fox commissary is pretty telling. So here's all these famous actors, just name it, the panoply of stars having lunch in this commissary, and agents and press people and just all the important people. It stopped dead. It was awesome. And she wasn't even trying. She was in a robe over her costume. She walked in to get some lunch, and the whole place came to a complete standstill. So there was a costume designer by the name of Will Trevia. He said she was a joy because she was so beautiful. He was the guy who did her clothes. There was a group of, hang on, let me check something here. I think I'm going to end this right here. This chapter tends to run long, and I don't want this video to run any longer. So I'm going to end this here, and I'll be right back, and we'll start with number 4. So this is the end of video number 3, and thank you very much for watching.